Hey everybody, this is James P. Wagner here with Local Gems Press. I'm here with Nick Hale.
Hi, James. Hi, everybody.
How's it going, Nick? And
All right.
this is a topic that we get very often, which is how to go about selling your poetry book. In fact, some other seminars we do about putting together a poetry book has sort of half turned into a lot of the topics in this seminar about how to sell your poetry book once you have the poetry book. So figured it was time to do this again. Although, admittedly speaking, the playing field has changed a little bit since we first threw together this presentation, because something happened in the world that kind of changed the ability to gather for a couple of years there, and then we kind of had to figure out how to go about selling it virtually as well as live and in person. We're going to touch on that a little bit in this as well, with a little bit of updated information, although you could have a whole seminar on how to sell your poetry book virtually, which actually we also have that, but this is the main thing. So anyway, without further ado, selling your poetry book, A Poet's Guide to Marketing. That's just a picture of some various books that we have had at various events. And the best way to start out talking about how to go about selling a poetry book would be just to give everybody a few facts about poetry books in general, when it comes to the sales statistics and the numbers and things like that. Because sometimes there's a little bit of confusion about this, and people ask us a lot about that, like what constitutes a poetry bestseller. There's general confusion anyway on just what constitutes a bestseller, period, because we hear all the time about the extreme, very high level bestsellers, like the 1% of the 1%. We hear about the Tolkien's, the J.K. Rowling's, things like that. For fiction, the traditional bestseller, like the one that'll make the Times list, is actually only between 7,500 copies and 10,000 copies. For nonfiction, it's between 5,000 and 7,500 copies. So you have a lot of best-selling authors out there whose names you might not have never heard of, who kind of do that as a living, but they're on the lower end of the bestseller. And I know that there are some poetry books out there that are sell much more than that, but those are usually the dead great poets that we know in the canon, also known as the ones that the publishing companies don't have to pay royalties to because all their stuff is public domain. But for contemporary poetry book sales, best-selling is considered between 500 and 800 copies. As sad as that is. And the average contemporary poetry book sale is actually less than 100 copies. And 98% of published poetry collections will never find their way in traditional bookstores. So, hopefully this cheery information at the start doesn't discourage you, because I know for a fact some people who register for this are actually already done better than the averages. So there's that to be grateful for, at least.
Yeah, and when we're talking about bestsellers, I mean, there are plenty of different ways you can become a bestseller without being, say, on the New York Times bestsellers list. You have a lot of people who will achieve bestseller in their specific categories, and Amazon will then be able to say that they're an Amazon bestseller in new poetry books about graveyards or whatever the book's about. So it's not totally discouraging, because you have to look at it proportionate to how much of that book is selling overall.
Yeah, it's also worth noting that the New York Times bestseller list also only even considers books that come from certain publishers. So there's actually a lot of books out there that have sold way more than are on the New York Times bestseller list, who the New York Times will never actually list. So that's just something to get out there. But before we get into like the various ways to go about selling, one's poetry book and do the marketing and all that, we should talk about the traditional way of publishing versus what the new ways are, because in the last 15-20 years, especially since the rise of the internet, traditional models of publishing and the ways that people did things have been very, the snow globe has been very shaken up, and there's been a lot of confusion. Some things that used to work don't work anymore. A lot of things that didn't used to work now can work in the right situation. But regular distribution, had the traditional way that publishers did it in the latter half of the 20th century. It always kind of had built-in problems when it came to poets. In particular, because bookstore chains typically, there's a regional distributor for those bookstore chains, like they'll supply it to, say, like 20-30 stores in an area, and the way that publishers would get books on those shelves in those bookstores is they have a deal with the distributor, and then the distributor has a deal with the stores. But to work with the distributor, you're talking about printing large quantities of the books up front. 1,000 is an average, and in some cases actually low. They might want 2,000 or 3,000 copies of a book that you would then send to the distributor, and then the distributor would then send to the various bookstores in the region, and they would have a period of time that they would keep them on the shelf, sometimes 6 months, sometimes a year, in which case that basically they have that period to sell on the shelf. And most of the time, unless you negotiated it, it's going to be like they're on the shelf and all you see is the spine sticking out, not necessarily even a big display or a lot of advertising for that. So in 6 months, if you don't sell all the copies that have been distributed, usually you have to, as the publisher, guarantee to buy back up to usually 70% of the copies that don't sell. And like we just said, if the minimum is 1,000, and what we just talked about, best selling for a poetry book is anywhere between 500 and 800, you're already kind of betting on a book being a bestseller before it even hits the shelves. And not all publishers have that type of huge heavy initial investment to actually put into those books, which is why you would see poetry sections in the bookstore getting smaller and smaller, because again, you're talking at $3,000, $5,000, $10,000 upfront investments per title just to get it on the shelf. And then you might not even sell the number of books, you most likely weren't going to sell the number of books required to even make that back. So this was kind of a built-in problem for poetry distribution with the old model, or the traditional model of publishing. But like we said, this model has been shaken up a little bit in the last 15 or 20 years, which has kind of given some people a glimmer of hope in that regard. One thing that people often note about is, the poetry that comes out of, academic poets, academic titles, and academic presses. And just want to do some, sort of explaining behind the curtain about the magic behind that, and why, academic poets sometimes have an advantage over the non-academic poets when it comes to the presses and the built-in distribution that, happens there. Because over 50% of academic poetry titles are published by university presses. Maybe precious, you never know. But yeah, sometimes my mouth goes faster.
That's a matter of opinion.
Yeah, well, that's true. So some of those university presses are quite precious, and some of them maybe not. That's for you to decide. But the thing about university presses is that they have a built-in distribution network between the college and the university libraries. Like if you're in America, there is approximately 2,000 college libraries. And college and university libraries, and they usually buy 2 copies when they buy a book. So if you're a university press and you're putting forth this latest book by a poetry book by your professor, and you have the built-in distribution network with the 2,000 academic libraries in the US, you've already got 4,000 copies of the book sold just based on your pre-existing distribution deal, and you didn't have to do step 1 of marketing or out there trying to sell it. It kind of just happened, and it's everywhere. And if you're in the academic circle, people kind of know everybody, and it kind of spreads like that. So there's a little bit of a built-in advantage, with what's pre-negotiated before the book even has a chance to hit the shelf in that regard. So that's why sometimes academic poets and academic presses have an advantage in that regard.
Yeah, a lot of them are also supported by external funding, grants and things like that. So they don't need to worry so much about meeting certain numbers or making a profit off of each book sold. And that's why you'll see some of them do crazy things like charge $40 for an ebook version of their book.
Yeah, I've seen that happen, because they don't really necessarily care if it sells that much in that regard. Yeah, so one thing that we of course promised to talk about here, about the seminar, is talking about what's the biggest mistake that a poet makes when trying to sell their book. In suspense for a moment.
Oh, I almost spoiled it because I thought you were waiting for me to say it.
Well, go ahead, say it.
Oh, that's selling to only poets.
Mm-hmm. We see this all the time out there, in the field of, going to open mics and, readings and features and all that stuff. A poet comes out with a book, and, they go around and they advertise it to all the poets in their group. Usually they'll sell some, some more than others, depending on, how they're perceived in the group, or, how widely known they are. And then usually they stop selling them, and then they're like, oh, well, I guess I've run out of my market. The thing here is that publishing a poetry book, though, isn't actually a rare thing when it comes to poets, because if you're in a poetry group, or, in classes, workshop groups, etc., you probably know people who have books. So, it's not exactly like this has never happened before. But on the other hand, publishing a poetry book is rare and exciting to your family, your friends, your coworkers, your bridge club members, people who aren't necessarily in the writing circles and probably don't very often get invited to book launches, tours, features, etc. So yeah, there's a lot of space out there that poets usually don't really even consider. I mean, speaking from the end of people who publish chapbooks, when we usually ask people like how many copies of something they want, one of two things happens most of the time. Usually people either overestimate how many copies they need because they think that, they're going to sell like, they're going to go on a national tour and sell thousands of copies, or they think, well, who's going to really want my book? I'm only going to take, like 25 copies or whatever, or that, or it's like, and then a month later, they're like, oh my God, all those copies, my family, my friends really wanted all these, I need to order more. People don't really realize how quickly they could actually eat that up. And then we're just talking people in your life. We're not even getting into all the other things we're going to discuss in a little bit.
Yeah, and as a sort of a corollary to this, and maybe a little bit of a spoiler for what's coming next, another common mistake people make is selling their poetry book as a poetry book. So poetry is a medium. It's not even a genre or a topic. So think about it like if you go to see a movie, you don't go to the movie theater and say, I want to see a movie today, and I don't care what movie it is. If somebody tries to pitch you a movie or a fiction book and say, yeah, you want to buy my fiction book, it's a work of fiction. That tells you absolutely nothing about what's in it. So a lot of people market their poetry book just like that. They stop at the word poetry. And that's also a big mistake.
Exactly. I mean, maybe when it comes to fiction, if it's like you want to buy my novel, maybe novel lovers might really like it. But there are people who literally just eat up novels. But generally speaking, you lead with what the book is about, and we're going to get into that, quite a bit in the upcoming slides here. This picture here, though sadly it's before I had my facial hair, so I never liked how I looked before facial hair. But this was a booth that we had at a convention in Maryland. For local gems, where we were there. I think we were doing a presentation on Japanese poetry at one point, and so we got a table also. But this was very largely a not poetry event. It was all kinds of things. It was like comics, anime, manga, sci-fi, fantasy, just general family fun stuff, artwork, etc. I don't think we were the only people there who had poetry, but we were the only poetry booth there. And we did get a lot of attention when it comes to that, because probably every third or fourth person who walked by was like, oh, poetry. Some of them are like, I kind of write poetry, this or that or whatever. Oh, I really love reading poetry. So it was a non-poetry centered event. And there are plenty of non-poetry centered events out there where poetry is welcome and is very rare. Poetry, again, it's very normal at poetry readings. And speaking as a publisher and also a book owner here, a book owner. Yes, I own books, a bookstore owner. This might sound a little sacrilegious too, because I know I'm supposed to promote like the book fairs and things like that, but it's like people sign up to have a booth at a lot of those book fairs. They spend ridiculous amounts of money, $500, $1,000 to have them there, and they realize that they're swamped with competition because everybody who's there has a book that they're trying to sell, and then there's lots of publishers there that are trying to vie for authors' attention, and it's you have a much harder time actually being recognized there. Whereas you go with your poetry to a non-poetry event, and you can stand out a lot more, and you're not dealing with nearly as much competition. And it's unique and it's exciting, and people might come over and they might be interested. So, that's definitely one thing to consider.
Yeah, and I mean the flip side of that, and the one thing in advantage, the advantage that book fairs have is that everybody who's there to buy books is there to buy books. But you can use that to your advantage in non-book centric events, because there are plenty of people, I'm one of those people, so I know that the thought process, who go to those events looking for something that they wouldn't normally find there. If you're going through the dealer's room at, let's say, an anime convention, for example, every third table is probably just going to be DVDs and like the same stuff. So typically when I'm at any kind of event where there's a big vendor space, I'm looking for the stuff that stands out, the stuff that's not like what everybody else has. And there are plenty of people like that. And you can definitely grab those people's attention by going to non-poetry centric events with your poetry book.
Yeah, and there's no shortage of places where you can get a table. I mean, especially around the holidays, there's craft fairs and swap meets and things like that. I mean, some craft fairs, have specific rules about it must be handmade, but a lot of them are also kind of open to, artists or artsy types kind of doing, small print runs or small, like of their art prints or whatever, and they're perfectly open to having, poetry chapbooks or poetry books there, is, basically because it's centered around the art. So mileage may vary, rules may vary, but there's a lot of places to do that, and those are just one example of it. There are specific days like in Northport. There's Art in the Park, and they actually started pre-COVID. They started allowing poets to have a poetry table, even though this day is mostly about artwork and a lot of canvas artwork. They recognized that there were poets in the area, so they were charging only $25 for the day to have a little 4x4 poetry table to put your poetry books on. Craft fairs at high schools, church meets, things like that. And then we're going to get into a little bit more about the topical stuff, but if your poetry book is actually about something specific, you can pair it with an event about that specific thing. Like one example we talk about a lot is we've had poets who, breast cancer survivor, and they have poetry books about their experience with breast cancer. So they get invited to have tables all the time at a lot of breast cancer festivals and fairs and fundraisers. And, they get a lot of attention there because their poetry is about that topic. But we'll get into that a little bit later in the presentation. The book launch is another thing that one should do, and is more often than not overlooked when it comes to launching your poetry book, because I've seen a lot of cases where they come out with a book, and then a host of a monthly poetry meeting will be like, oh, come here and feature on the first Friday or whatever, and the poet will kind of see that as the launch for their book. The problem with that, though, is it doesn't really signify the big deal that coming out with the book is. And people might go there because they go to this reading, but it's not quite the same thing as making an event out of it.
Yeah, some people who show up to that reading may not even realize that it's a book launch. And if you're going to be launching your book, you want everybody who's there to be there because they were there because they wanted to attend your book launch, not just because they wanted to go to a reading and hear some poetry. So you want to
it's supposed to be the author's big day, you want to think of it like, maybe not quite a wedding, but something in the same vein as that, like a birthday party, thing like that. You gather your family, your friends, coworkers, your poetry friends. It needs to be its own standalone event, separate from the regular monthly things. So people, because like Nick just said, people show up to those things out of habit. They might not know that even this is even going on. And the other thing is that in the regular world, book launches, they're rare. People may have, seen like at certain bookstores, like, oh, this famous author is doing a signing, but how many times does the average person get invited to a book launch for a book by somebody that they know? In poetry, that happens a lot. In, the world of your family and friends and your coworkers, not nearly as often. Of course, when it comes to planning a book launch, and by the way, this picture is of a book launch we did actually at the Bermuda Lodge in Deer Park. It was for an anthology, and it was around Halloween time, as you can see from the picture, but, packed house. The questions to ask is, should you provide food or not have food? Should there be other talent at your book launch? Do you invite other poets to read, or maybe musicians or something like that? Because, you see it all the time where bands, they have, openers and closers, acts to go along with that, to kind of build in on that audience as well. Not a bad idea necessarily for poets to maybe do the same. You're launching your book, but maybe bring in a couple people to kind of read before you or open for you. Other questions you ask about that is, the location. There's really no shortage of places to do the book launches. A lot of times we see people trying to get a venue for free, which, it can work in the right situation. Like you could do it in a banquet room at a restaurant, as long as people buy food, or you could rent a space like a VFW hall, a mini theater, a restaurant, something like that, or a hotel event space, things like that, where basically you just pay a fee and then you can do whatever you want with the space. This is a picture from a book launch that I did back in, I think it was 2016. It was a mini theater that was not far from where I am right now. So I just did that. And this next one was down in Nick's area. What was the name of this place, Nick?
That was Gregorio's. Yeah, that was an Italian restaurant that has a big private room in the back. And they let us use the private room basically in exchange for a promise that people would be ordering food.
Yeah, so there's really no shortage of ways that you can kind of finagle a location to do the book launch, and again, you plan enough in advance, you make a big deal out of it. So we talked a little bit about this previously. Nick can probably elaborate on this a little bit because of what he was just talking about with, what is it about, and not just, oh, this is my poetry book. You want my poetry?
Yeah, so if you've been to our putting together poetry book presentation already, you know about the discussion of whether or not to theme your book, and this is where the theming really comes in handy. But even if you don't have a set theme for your book, there's probably something that all the poems in your book have in common, or probably a reason why somebody would want to buy it, other than that it's a collection of poetry. And that's really what you want to focus on, because how many poetry books are out there? I don't even know. There's so many. So what makes your book stand out from all those other books? And most people, when they're going to buy a book of poetry, unless they're like poetry super fans, they're not specifically looking to buy any old book of poetry. They have something specific that they're looking for. And so your goal then is to connect your book to the people who are looking for what your book is. And in order to do that, you need to define what it is, figure out what it is. So are you writing in a specific niche about a specific topic a lot? Are you writing in a specific style? Are there some famous poets your style is comparable to? Do you write like E.E. Cummings, for example? All of these things will help sort of define what your book is and give somebody a reason to want to buy it, other than that, oh, it's poetry, or oh, they like you. And they like you is a legitimate reason for somebody to want to buy your book. Didn't really get into that much. But you don't want to have to rely on that, because that means you're going to have to make friends with every single person you want to sell your book to. And that's, if you want to be a bestseller, I mean, that's 500, 800 people right there.
Yeah, that's a lot of friends. I mean, one thing that, a lot of poets, they seem to instinctively want to avoid is they don't like being pigeonholed. They don't want to, I think that's a creative person thing in general. You don't want to be seen as, oh, you're the person who writes about X, you're the person who writes about Y. But, as actors will tell you, because a lot of actors have the same thing, niche is really your king, because that's where you find your market. And it doesn't mean that that's all you have to do, but, you get established as, a couple of things first, and then you can kind of branch off from there. And the thing is like, the collection you're writing doesn't even necessarily have to be only about one theme, but if there's something that's a common thread through there, you can kind of, relate it to things that are happening out there, like breast cancer, autism, gardening, landscaping, love. We've done, challenges, chapbook challenges and all sorts of things. One of them was poetic memoir, where people were basically writing memoir, but they were doing it in poetry form. And so, there's people out there who really like certain types of memoir, and they were finding that, oh, this is actually about, like it's poetry and I'm writing in poetry, but this is really about the history of, like growing up, first generation Italian immigrant or something like that. And people were actually like making connections with, what the things were about with their life, and then finding, markets out there to move it in those cases. It's also worth noting that a lot of the, famous poetry out there in the world right now, there's actually a lot of it. It's not usually referred to as poetry. Dr. Seuss, for example, those books are basically, as poetry as you get, but it's not called poetry. It's called kids books and all that. Hallmark cards, things like that. You go to corporate events where they have these mantras where they're doing the rah rah and trying to get people in the spirit to peak performance. There's a lot of poetry involved in that. It's just not referred to as that. Religion, just about every religious text has a lot of poetry in it, but they don't call it that. So there's plenty of poetry out there, but you don't refer to it as poetry first. You refer to it as the thing that it's doing or connecting to.
Yeah, I think actors are a good comparison when you talk about being pigeonholed or not getting stuck in a niche. I mean, you look at, say, The Rock, started out as a professional wrestler, got into action, then got into more serious movies and comedy. I mean, he became more versatile, but he started somewhere. He started in a specific niche and became an expert in that niche first. Or Robin Williams is another good example. Towards the end of his career, he did a lot more serious style of movies, but he started out in comedy, and that's where he really got established first, and then he branched out once he sort of built his name. You want to do something similar with that, where there's nothing wrong with branching out, but if you want to branch out successfully, you need to be sort of established in something first.
Yeah, and it also doesn't need to mean that's the only thing you write about. I write a lot of poems on a lot of topics, but eventually I see like, oh, I have this many poems that's kind of about this, and then I kind of start to form a book around that, and that at least that works for me anyway. Like, here's an example of just a topic. If you have poems about spirituality, You know, you might pair up with church fairs, religious bookstores, yoga centers, spiritual retreats, or conventions based on that topic. And these are all be places that you could potentially find a market for your book, or you might find the ability to do a reading, you know, or something like that. There's, you know, and that's just a very general topic, but there's all sorts of places you can kind of bend it in to, you know, do that.
Yeah, so basically you're looking for avenues to sell your book that go along with the topic rather than just with poetry.
We talked about this a little bit. That's a picture there actually from, because this was an anthology that myself and Robert Savino, a fellow poet laureate here on Long Island, we edited. It was poetry by Long Island Italian Americans. And it's actually a bilingual anthology, so it was kind of fun to do. But this was an Italian festival at Hofstra that they have every year, which is, you know, big on Italian culture. So we obviously connected with them, and they invited us to do a reading at their their breakfast there that they had in front of everybody, and then we had a table at the festival and sold copies and, you know, all that. Also, there was also good sausage and peppers because it was an Italian festival. But yeah, so, you know, again, tables at Saturday, Sunday fairs, church fairs, flea markets, festivals. You know, how many authors do you regularly see at these? You know, I've, you know, over the years I've encountered, you know, one or two here or there. Sometimes like a kid's author, maybe sometimes somebody had a novel, but up until very recently, I didn't really very often see poets there with their poetry book at these types of things. So it's, you know, there's definitely a wide open area to do that. And depending on where you are, you know, the tables can be, you know, well, like I'm in New York, so everything's expensive. But even for here, it's like, you know, maybe $50 a day, $75 a day at the highest to be there. You know, and you're doing that in the holiday season when there's, you know, thousands of people there, though, you know, you can get a lot of traffic for that. In other places, it's even cheaper. Like I've seen in some parts of Pennsylvania, I've seen tables at flea markets go for like $10 a day, you know, so depending on where you are and, you know, if you're willing to make a trip and how many places you're willing to go, you know, because that's another thing that we always talk about is that, you know, basically what you want to do, you know, should be determined by what goals you have. Some people have more time and resources and energy to put into it than other people. So we can't necessarily prescribe the same thing for everybody, you know, because some people may only want to move X number of copies for a fundraiser. Some people may want to, you know, become the next Billy Collins, and some people may only want to have copies to give to their family. So what we would prescribe would be different in all these cases, but these are just general ideas that you could do. So of course, when one has a book published by either a small press or, you know, which in poetry is almost all the presses, I don't know too many what you would call huge presses when it comes to poetry, except for ones that are big for publishing other things, and then they also publish the, you know, the dead famous ones that we just talked about where they're royalty free.
Well, I guess you could count university presses in that.
Yeah, because an interesting thing about the dichotomy of you know, business and poetry is that in every other art form, you sort of have the grassroots, the academic, and then the industry. You know, the three different pillars. Like you see that in art, you'll see that in music, you'll see that in theater. With poetry, though, you don't have an industry. So by default, the academic scene kind of became the industry. So you kind of have grassroots and academic. You know, so it's time for a poetry industry, darn it. No, but yeah, I mean, then again, there's also misconceptions about what small press and large press means, because technically speaking, a small press just means you publish less than 200 titles in a year as a press. So you could be a small press and have one book that you sold this year, and it could have sold 50 million copies. You'd still be considered a small press. It has nothing to do with the amount of books, just the amount of titles. But obviously, the thing that, you know, people think about is, you know, going to independent bookstores, you know, et cetera, when that happens. The problem is, and I can say this now even better than I could back then when we first wrote this presentation, as an indie bookstore owner, you get bombarded with a lot of requests to have your book in the place. I probably had 300 the weeks before I opened, let alone after I opened. And so, you know, it's possible to be in indie bookstores, but, you know, you're going to have to tell them why. It's not just like, oh, hey, I have a book. Do you want this in the store? Which I get probably 20 times a week. And the thing that I, you know, I always try to be nice about it, but it's like, okay, but you know, what's the angle here? Like, how's this book going to sell, or is it just going to sit on the shelf? You know, having a book is great, but, you know, it doesn't really mean much if you can't match it with people who want it. So,
And this is where we get back to defining your book. You want to make sure that you understand the reasons why somebody would want your book.
Yeah, exactly. Like, for example, I'm in the town of Northport. If somebody comes here and they're like, "Hey, I have, I wrote my poetry book, which is a little bit about my life. I grew up in Northport, and I'm talking about all these old stores that were on Main Street that aren't there anymore." That would be like, "Oh, okay, there's people here who might be interested in that." Um, but indie bookstores, while an option, are often oversaturated. However, there are one thing that people often overlook when it comes to trying to sell the book is they're always going for the bookstores, but there may be fewer bookstores than there used to be in general, but there are more places now that sell books than there ever used to be. You may have noticed that you walk into your supermarket, there's a huge book section. That like I've lost track of how many places have a book section at this point. And when it comes to smaller town stores or mom and pop places like gift shops, cafes, things like that, there's a lot of places that maybe might sell books that you could figure out as a good match. Like this picture here is actually a Bards Against Hunger 5th anniversary book that we did. And this was actually a little shelf that they had at a bar restaurant outside of Philadelphia. And they had that on the shelf there because one of the regulars who goes to the place was in the book. And so they just did it for that. So pretty much anywhere that sells books, or you could think of might finagle to sell books, because there was one guy who it wasn't his book, it was an anthology that we did in southeast Pennsylvania, but he wrote a poem about a bakery that he's gone to for years, and so the bakery wanted 20 copies of this book just because of this one poem in there that it was about them. So there's all sorts of reasons why people might want to put that there, and they're not always obvious either. And of course, we can't overlook online marketing, which is something we could talk about a lot more now that COVID happened, and people kind of got herded into online events. And when when COVID started, like one thing that we've said for years, and I still abide by this, is that nothing sells a poetry book like a live event where the poet is behind the table and signing copies and people see the poet. I still say that, but during COVID, we did figure out ways that actually could, you could have a successful online book launch and do pretty okay. I mean, Amazon is the #1 seller of books in the world. Essentially, that's where most of the world's books are sold. So it's not like they're not selling books on there. But to qualify that, because one thing that people always say is like, "Oh, we're going to put the book on Amazon," which isn't really hard to do. And then people are like, "Oh, should we put an ebook on there and this or that or whatever?" Just put it out there. People will find it. It's like, that's not really how it works. People don't, people should ask themselves, when's the last time you went on Amazon and you just looked through like the category of poetry to find a random poetry book by a random poet that you had no idea who they were and were like, "Oh, I need that." I mean, it happens every so often, but it's not usually the modus operandi, so to speak. Even for someone like me who loves poetry, if I'm going to buy a poetry book on Amazon, it's usually by somebody who I know, or somebody who was recommended to me by somebody that I know and trust. It's not like I just go randomly searching for it. That's something
Yeah.
that might happen more often actually in a physical store where you impulse buy something because it's cheap there, but not so much online.
Well, the sheer number of books that are on Amazon, because some people think, oh, I'll just rely on the recommendeds and the algorithm and the like frequently bought together suggestions and all that, and somebody will find it eventually. And once people start buying it, more people will buy it. The thing is, the sheer number of books on Amazon means that you need to have some traction first before you start getting picked up by those things. So like the frequently bought together, if nobody's buying your book, then it's not going to be frequently bought with anything. So you need some sales and some traction and some attention on your book before you start getting into those sorts of things. So yeah, just relying on that is not going to be helpful, because there are billions of books on Amazon. And so the chances of your one book sticking out, because Amazon's algorithms are all designed around selling things that are proven to sell.
Yeah.
So the more sales you get, the more likely you are to be picked up by, the frequently bought together or other sorts of recommended things. Or if you end up peaking as a bestseller on a specific category, you'll have some more visibility, but you need to get there first.
Yeah, and we have a bad habit as a society in general of kind of, emotionally flogging ourselves by putting the extreme outlier examples of out of nowhere success like up on a pedestal and tell the stories 10,000 times that, you know, we don't really focus on the 999,999 times it didn't work doing it that way. So people sometimes get unrealistic expectations, and they think that, you know, you just, you know, if you build it, they will come, which very, very rarely happens. Like people like to talk about that book Milk and Honey, which, you know, became like an international best-selling poetry book that sold way more copies than most poetry books sell. I don't know what the exact number was, but people overlook the, you know, what happened before that was that, you know, this girl who wrote it had a very, very big Instagram following that she had by writing little quotes and poems with pictures on Instagram. And so when the time came for her that she put out this book, there was already an audience there, and they were like, oh, well, we really like this girl, so let's buy this book, you know, like, and it wasn't necessarily that people even wanted the poetry exactly as much as they liked her and the content she was putting out. And then, you know, the poetry world was like, oh, wow, this poetry book is selling really well, we better buy it too. And so, you know, because things kind of clump together, you know, when there's success, it rides, and when there's failure, it kind of goes down pretty fast too. So, you know, there's things like that. But, you know, you want to think of online marketing as kind of fan consolidation, because, you know, on the other hand, like I know a local poet laureate here on Long Island, actually, who he doesn't have his books up on Amazon, but he came out with this one, you know, this book a few years ago, and he just put it up for sale on eBay as like a, you know, buy it now option. And then he just spread it around via email and Facebook and things like that, and he sold a couple of hundred copies without leaving his house, basically just shipping them out just from that, you know. So there are ways to do it if people know you. And you know, poetry, you know, it's generally an in-person thing. And that's still the case even in the COVID world. You know, the energy of a live event really can't be replaced, but it can, you know, online can help improve upon it and can make things more efficient at the same time. To like the story that I was just telling about how we discovered during COVID ways to actually sell things online. We had when that happened, we had to cancel, like it was like a 13 stop, you know, book tour we were going to be doing in April that year, and then in March there it's like, bam, can't do that anymore. It's like, oh well, that's nice. uh, you know, obviously nobody was expecting that coming, but so we had all these books that were being launched that people were waiting for, and we're like, well, obviously we have to do them online. So and then you don't get the same, well, you don't get the energy, you don't get to have the tables in front of you where people can reach it, you can't do the signings and all that stuff. But we were able to kind of set up, you know, basically marathon reading with people reading from the anthologies. And then we had like a telethon style thing where we said, okay, if you attend, you know, during this time to this time of the launch for 2 hours, and you buy the copy, you know, during this time, we'll donate half of the profits to Feeding America. And so, you know, kind of like, you know, the telethon style, basically people, you know, we were kind of telling everybody, oh, okay, looks like we just sold this many copies at this point. Now let's get back to some more poetry. And so, you know, it was like, oh, we have this fundraising goal too. So then people were kind of coming in and they were buying, and, you know, eventually it's like, hey, look at that. In this 2 hours, we sold like, you know, 70 something copies of these books, you know, just by this or whatever. So, you know, there are ways to make it work. You know, pairing it with, you know, a cause or, you know, some kind of charity definitely helps. Giving that, you know, time limit, because, you know, the thing is like with an online event, you know, like we're here right now, it's like, you know, there's no table to put a book in, you know, in front of anybody to be like, here, you could buy it now. And you don't get the excitement necessarily of taking it home right now, but you could still add excitement other ways. Like it could also be, if you want to buy this book from this time to this time, you'll get some kind of a bonus. Like, you know, here's, you know, 5 ebooks that you can download when you buy this print book, you know, like, and you can download the ebooks immediately and the book will come to you in a week through the mail or whatever. Although admittedly back then it was more like, you know, 7 years based on how the post office was working. But yeah, so there are things that you can do to do it online, but it still comes down to, you know, how many people know you, how many people know your work, what topics are you pairing it with, you know, all of that.
Yeah, and the interesting part when James was talking about Milk and Honey, for example, is that we really like this girl. That's very important, especially when selling online. A big catalyst to getting sales is a connection with your audience, a relationship with your readers. So the more somebody likes you, the more your readership likes you, the more likely they are going to want to support you and to want to buy your book.
Mhm. And one great way to maintain presence online is the author website, which is something that a lot of people don't have. And it's not completely necessary for, you know, if you're going to be going around in person and doing all that. But if you're aiming to, you know, do any kind of online selling or marketing, or just want to consolidate your fan base in a good way where you can connect with them, you know, having some kind of an author presence online is pretty essential. A lot of people, they just have like either, you know, some kind of social media page. which is good, but that's really more like the outpost for spreading the word. It's not necessarily the word itself. And there's less ways that you can kind of control social media. Like you can't really, you can't as easily list, a book for sale or throw together like a bundle or, give this out or that out as easily. So the good news is, though, there are a lot of free options when it comes to websites. Blogger, if you want to go really old school, WordPress is definitely up there these days. So having like a station online where people can learn more about you and your work, it improves your chances of, getting gigs. It improves your chances of people connecting with you, and, more opportunities can arise by that. You kind of can think of it partly as an online portfolio and partly as online outreach. You can collect email addresses, make a fan list, show, give people poems for free or do little videos of you reciting. Again, like I just said, the Milk and Honey person with the Instagram, it was all on Instagram where she built up a really big following that way, but then, she connected with the fans, that way, and then other ways. And, you built the online presence, and then the rest kind of happened from there. So never underestimate the importance of an author website.
Yeah. And one thing to be careful of, though, one caveat when using your author website, and also when using social media and when trying to build those relationships with people, is there's a right way and a wrong way to do it. And I rarely say there's a wrong way to do things, but in this case, people tend to resist when they feel like something's fake, or when they feel like somebody's trying to sell to them. And I've seen this happen a lot, especially with people using social media, where like I know a particular person who will often quote himself, and almost everything he posts is either his own quotes or trying to sell something of his. Like everything just screams self-promotion, but he frames it in a way where it seems like he's trying to make a connection with his followers. And so the whole thing just comes off as kind of unpleasant.
Yeah, and big surprise,
People
that
can
person
tell.
that person doesn't really gig too much anymore because the little that it worked kind of dried up. So there's an organic
Yeah.
way to make connections, and then there's an inorganic way to make connections. So yeah,
People can tell when you're faking it, or when you're just trying to get something from them. So be very careful of that. A little bit of genuineness, it goes a long way, and you can usually tell when someone's being genuine.
yeah, like if you're writing your book is about something, obviously it's going to organically be about something. Again, like a memoir about like growing up, as an Italian immigrant off the boat, or breast cancer stuff. These are real experiences. These are real things you're writing to. There's obviously some real emotion, some real connection there. Good to go with that, because we've also seen people who they've taken exactly the wrong message of this, and they've pulled every topic they possibly could have out of their book, and they tried to advertise it to every single group or cause or anything out there. And most people kind of, within a 5-minute conversation, though, people in these areas realize that this person really wasn't really that genuine or really into whatever it was that they were doing, and it didn't end well. So yeah, or definitely like you want to connect with people and all that, but you do want to do it organically.
Yeah, that's why you write what you know and write what you're passionate about.
Yeah. And then here's just some other uses for the book. This isn't strictly about selling, but this could actually lead to sales down the road, because some people do underestimate certain things, like, for example, donating to libraries, which can be easier or harder depending on where you live, because some libraries are just overloaded with books and they don't take donations practically at all. But other libraries, if you have a book and you're local to them, a lot of them do want to support. I mean, sometimes they'll even buy your book, but if not, you could donate it to them, and sometimes they'll put it on the shelf for that. Which is, if you can get it into a library, it's good, though, because once it's in the system for usually the whole county, the whole state, the whole area it's in. So pretty much one could be seen by a lot. Could be donated to causes. Like we did an anthology for the 20th anniversary of 9/11 this past year, and I actually got invited to do a reading of it at the 20th anniversary ceremony at the East Northport Fire Department, which is where my bookshop is, in front of like 400 people, to do that. And then we donated we had like basically a thing where people bought one copy, we donate a copy. So we donated hundreds of copies to the East Northport Fire Department, Northport Fire Department, like a bunch of fire departments in this area. And then, obviously we weren't doing it, to sell more copies. That was just because we wanted to give it to first responders. But one of the side benefits of it, you do a good thing, sometimes good things happen, was that, they got the copies, then like their wives and other people in their family saw it, and then they went online and then they bought copies. So we kind of got copies ancillary from that. Poets also like to trade books. I mean, if you don't want to look at it strictly as monetarily, like you want dollars for it, you can build up a nice library of, other people's work just by trading your own book. I've seen people who've done that quite a lot. And gifts, in some cultures, giving the gift of poetry is viewed to be giving somebody a piece of your soul, which is what we say for the gift of poetry program that we usually do around the holidays, where people just want to give out their poems as gifts. Some people, they get 25, 50 copies, etc., just to give them out, either as party favors or holiday gifts or whatever, without any intention to actually sell. There was one woman for years, published a lot of her books, that she had been kind of writing poetry her whole life, and she ended up with something like 50 chapbooks or something at the end. I didn't publish all of them, but I did publish several. But she wanted exactly 64 copies of every book, just because there were 64 people in her family, and she wanted to give one copy to everybody. She had no interest whatsoever in selling them. And so again, it comes, different goals, different strokes for different folks. So these are just some other ideas that you could do with a poetry book. And that's pretty much it for the main presentation, unless Nick has any closing thoughts.
No, I think we can get ready to jump into the Q&A.
Okay, so we're going to pause the recording, take a quick couple of minute break, and then come back and we'll restart the recording for the Q&A section. And for that case, you could either write a question in the chat, or you can unmute and ask a question. But so we will be right back for that.